Hello, everybody. My name's Ian. Today I'm going to discuss this traditional inks to digital colors image, this demon robot over water illustration. Um, like with most of these, I actually lay this out with a 2H Staedtler pencil, but I don't really show too much of that on the video because the camera really doesn't pick it up very much. So in this case, I'm starting with an HB lead in a mechanical pencil. You can see the tools that I actually am using in this particular illustration. So this would be the 2H Staedtler pencil that I'm using, an HB point 0.7 millimeter mechanical pencil. Then the bulk of the inking will be done with this modified Crow Quill pen using Staedtler Super Black ink. This has been modified to have uh, a pencil extender on it and then wrapped with electrician's tape to make it a little bit thicker, a little bit easier to use with my arthritis, hence the pressure glove. Mixed in with that will be some use of the brush for the inking. So, with this particular illustration, I'm doing this of a robot demon character posed for by my friend Erica here that we do a whole lot of work together. You'll definitely recognize her looking at the bulk of my work. Um, the rough idea I was going with was this demonic character in an abandoned industrial facility, kind of like a Philadelphia, or I'm sorry, a Pittsburgh uh, disused steam plant or steel factory or something. Um, with this gantry that she's standing on or crouching on, uh, directly over water, actually dipping into water. This allows me to play with some water effects, although not as bright, not as shiny as I do in a lot of other pieces, because it'll be very filthy water. This is like almost runoff. Um, in the same way that her metallic surface won't be as shiny as it'll be with some of the other robot pieces I've done. This will be a much darker, grittier piece than some of the other ones. Um, and here I'm starting to lay in the deep background. Whenever I do one of these pieces, in general, I do the composition from front to back. I start the composition with the main focus, the principal character or characters, and then work backward in space to create the setting. But once I've got that laid down, I much prefer to do the next stages from back to front. So in this stage, I'm doing the inking of the deepest background, this factory space. Um, I think she's actually in an outdoor setting. She's surrounded by machinery. She's surrounded by these buildings, but she's actually outdoors. So the sky would be the furthest thing off in the distance. Um, so there's this, yeah, disused factory space way off in the distance, and these pipes and such coming up out of the water, kind of alternating between the two as I'm inking. But the key thing is I'm only inking everything that's behind the main character, leaving this kind of gritty, punchy glow, almost halo around her. Um, this white space so that she'll pop forward in frame. In fact, you can see that that column in the middle ground, the column that's falling into the water, itself has a little bit of a halo on one side, on the left of frame, just to help separate it a little bit further from the deep background. And I'll tend to do that a lot with the various elements that are significantly different, removed from each other in space, where I'll try to leave a little bit of a gap of white to make them pop out a little bit more, depending on the type of illustration that I'm doing. For this one, it seemed appropriate. Um, and with all the inking I'm doing, you can really see it on this section of the background that I'm doing. With the Crow Quill pen, I'm using this very staccato style inking, almost a pointillism, where I'm just tapping and we're making extremely small, short strokes on the background. to add to this feel that everything's rusted out, it's broken, it's disused, it's kind of rotting. Um, but when I create that sense all the way through, I'll be doing a little bit of that on the main character because I want to get that same feel with her robot figure as well. But most of it will be in the environment. That will make the inks of the water stand out a lot, um, because all that'll be a lot smoother. Those will be a lot smoother lines. Also, talking about lines like that, um, most of the lines in the deep background and the middle ground are vertical. They're it's all creating the sense of vertical space of the height of the environment. When I move to the foreground and specifically the water, that's mostly going to be horizontal lines to further separate the water and the feel of the water from this gritty background. That as um, as waste infused as this water is this will definitely wouldn't be a water you'd want to be swimming in. It's still fundamentally a more natural um, substance, a more natural feel than the rest of the background. So here you can see that I'm already outlining these more horizontal shapes, conveying the movement of air over the top of the water, resulting in some movement in the water itself. Um, Now, when I get to the painting, I will be reflecting some light from the deep background down in a column, like in vertical slashes through that water as well. But I want the primary inks, the primary inking pattern in all of the water to be a lot more horizontal than vertical, just to further separate elements in space, um, create these combinations of direction for the setting for this character to live in. Um, and you can see that I've completely uh, not only have I not drawn the main character or that platform that she's standing on, but there's this kind of chunky halo all the way around both her and the platform, and creating the sense of the reflection of the main character, of this robot character in that water below her. With the main background done and the main inking on the water completed, now getting to the gantry, to the stairwell that she's crouching on. Again, loosely based on some old steel mills, any sort of abandoned factory space that's falling into disrepair, hasn't been looked at in years. I've seen these kind of gantries around. Normally, they're suspended a lot higher in the air. I just like the idea of playing with water. And when I had originally had Erica pose for this, originally I was thinking that she was on the edge of a building. Um, but then, very similar to this earlier piece I did with August, the winged robot in Winnipeg, the idea there as well was going to be that she was on the edge of a building looking down, and then I decided to make a water feature below that. I do tend to like to play with that because I like playing with reflections. Um, Now we're getting into uh, more of the black and white pattern on this gantry. Um, a bit more solid, larger blacks to define the pattern of light and dark, the pattern of lights falling on her. My rough idea for both the middle ground and the foreground is that there's light coming from both the left and the right. But it's very low. It's not a hugely well lit environment. More so on her than on the background. The background won't have quite as much lighting. But even with the background, you'll also notice the deepest part of the background, all the lighting is coming up from below. So there's either spotlights along the ground of this raised platform, or indeed some lights inside the building. Perhaps there are people inside there. That'll come up a little bit later when I add some additional white inking to this. Um, and with the main figure, I also wanted to create this pattern of cables. She has a metallic halo around her, unlike with um, the robot angel in the snow illustration I did with August, where there was a glowing white halo. With her, I wanted it to be this construction of wires, of loops of cable, and then bring that cable around the rest of her. It's kind of curling around. At one point, I was thinking about having that form her hair as well, but I've done that a few times with some of the cybergoth pieces I've done in the past few months. Um, so with this one, I thought I'll just go with a more traditional hairstyle. It clearly would be made out of metal, like the rest of her. Um, and now we're getting into where I've outlined the main figure, and now working on the interior space. I want to start with the face, chiefly with the eyes. That's always the most important part for me for working on a character illustration is working on the face. I want to make sure that I'm conveying something about the character with that face, and then the body language and the overall pose. Um, with like I said, with the deep background, light was coming up from below. With the middle ground, a lot of that light is also coming from below, but from both the left and the right. So as though there are lights close to the level of the water, just off frame on either the left or right side. On the main character, those lights are affecting it as well. But I also am thinking of a larger light somewhere above her to create large shadows in her abdomen that are being cast over her legs to get a strong sense of the mass of the character. And catching some of that right here with these deep inks in her hair, because basically her head is blocking that light, so casting a shadow onto the inside of the hair, and I'll be carrying that through to the rest of the figure, chiefly the abdomen, lower part of the legs. The bulk of her body will be casting shadows onto her legs. It's doing it onto the gantry a little bit as well, but there are other lights coming in from the sides that are minimizing that effect a little bit. You actually can see here that I'm actually outlining some of the where I'll be filling in with the heavy blacks, which is a technique that's used a lot in comics, where people will outline all those areas and then put it in X for somebody later on, or to remind themselves later to fill in those blacks. I don't like doing that because if I forget a piece, I don't want there to be this random X sitting in the middle when I go to color a piece, or when I think I finished it, and then a month later I look at it and realize there were a bunch of X's in this piece where I'd originally meant to fill it in with solid black. So now you can see the solid black on her, helping to define the direction of light, of helping to define the mass of the character, carrying that all the way through to where the fingers that are curling around the gantry have deeper shadows than the back of her hand, bringing in that same deeper shadow on the underside of her lower leg, in the same way that on her upper leg, on her thigh, I had done the same shadow pattern. Um, all this will serve to help me decide um, when doing the coloring, the digital coloring, where those light sources are coming from. Now here I'm enhancing the white halo a little bit with some white ink, my Dr. P.H. Martin's white ink. In this case, using a large speedball pen. I'd added in a few other effects like that, but this is basically the finished ink illustration. This has been scanned. The original ink illustration was done 11 inches by 17 inches on 100-pound smooth surface Strathmore Bristol paper. I then scanned it originally at 1200 DPI, but then dropped it down to 600 DPI for painting, but I still kept the 11 by 17 aspect ratio. And now I'm painting this in Clip Studio Paint. I'm switching away from Photoshop after decades. I'm giving this a shot, trying an experiment with this. And what I'm doing here is separating the line art into several different layers for the actual painting, and it'll make it a little bit easier for me to create some lighting effects on it later. So using the quick mask in Clip Studio Paint, I've isolated the main character and the gantry. That's that whole red area. That's just a selection. Once I remove the red portion, it's just an active selection, so I can copy it and then paste that as a separate layer. I'll be setting that layer to multiply, so that the white won't be there, though all the white areas will be able to paint through, but the black areas will remain black. It'll basically be multiplied onto the colors underneath it. Now that I have that section done on a separate layer, I'm taking the middle ground, the central column behind her, the radiation symbol, some of those pipes, putting them also on a separate layer to create this basically three levels of inking. The deep background and the water is on its own layer. The middle ground is on its own layer, and then the main character and the gantry is a separate layer. Between each one of these layers is where I'm going to be doing the painting. So starting with the deep background, you can see here I drop down the opacity on the deep background just to make it easier for me to see where everything is. But I'm going to be painting just like I did with the inking. I'll be painting the deep background first. But I'm actually laying down flat colors first. So these individual colors you're seeing right now, not necessarily going to be the colors they will be in the final painting, but these themselves will be separate layers. And they'll be locked into place using an alpha lock so that when I make a selection, I lock it in place, and then I can use the paintbrush tool. I can paint over the whole canvas, and only the part that was originally that particular color of blue or whatever will be affected when I'm painting on that layer. Makes things much simpler. Been doing variations of that with comics for a very long time. And like I said, on this one and with all the previous ones I've been showing whenever I'm doing any coloring, at this stage, each individual color is its own layer. So I can then go in and paint everything afterwards. So, but clearly, like her hair won't be this shade of pink. The the red on the main character is kind of similar to what the reds will end up being on her, but very often I'll end up for these flat layers picking colors that have nothing to do with the original, with what I want to end up painting it as. Like I want to do ones that annoy me, that I would find distracting if I forgot to paint them, so that I don't end up forgetting to paint them. I usually do these neon yellows and greens and really, really harsh colors. With this one, I wasn't going to be doing too many layers, so I didn't have to worry about that quite so much. It'd be very easy to remember which layer was which, and that I hadn't forgotten to paint something. But now I have all those flat layers done, so the flatting portion of all this is done. And I then went to the furthest background layer. So that's the deep background and the water underneath her. Filled it in completely with black. But now I'm going in and painting in shades of blue, with some warmer shades in the water as it gets closer to the viewer. But that's this just means that anything I paint here won't affect the middle ground, and it won't affect the main character. That's entirely being done on a layer behind all of the inking, and I'm free to play around with ideas using the basic color theory of things that are further away from the viewer are cooler and less saturated. So shifting towards blue and not having quite as much color. Things that are closer to the viewer are warmer and more saturated. So shifting more towards reds, yellows, oranges, and we'll have richer colors. That's the rough idea for that kind of color theory, for separation of planes, for creating a good separation of space. And that's basically what I'm doing with this one. The color temperature of the water, when I start painting that more, although right now you can see I'm painting in some of the lighting effects from those lights in the deep background. As it moves forward, it will be warmer, but closer to like browns and muddy purples and things like that. Um, the where I'm going to more of a red is actually reflecting what the main character will end up looking like. So I have an idea already of what the color scheme on the main character will end up being. So I very quickly paint in a simple variation on that in the water reflection underneath her. Now I'm applying a special effects layer. And this layer is only affecting the deep background coloring and that deep background of inking. It's only affecting everything way off in the distance, and it will affect the water underneath her. All the layers above it won't be affected by this at all. This is adding to creating that sense of depth and shifting it more to blue. Um, another common comic book style of illustration, and basically doing the same thing with the middle ground. The colors I'm using on these columns will be a little bit warmer than the deepest portion of the background. Pull it further forward in space, a little bit further forward towards the viewer. Um, and I will end up adding in another special effects layer over top of the middle ground line art, and that special effects layer will affect the middle ground line art, the middle ground coloring, the deep background line art, and the deep background coloring. So I better make sure that I want to have that that those effects. I better be comfortable with them affecting the deep background. Um, but I've been using this process for years and years, for decades at this point. So I've gotten pretty comfortable with knowing what it's going to end up looking like. Now I'm working on the foreground. So starting with the gantry, always starting with the simplest portion. I still don't want to get to the main focus of the illustration. Everything in the illustration needs to push the focus towards the main character. Um, but it is a more complicated paint job than in the background. Um, the inking on it is a little bit simpler than it was in the background, but that's just because of all that heavy industrial detail in the heavy background, and that heavy industrial detail in the inks meant that I didn't have to do a lot of complicated painting. I didn't need to worry about adding in a lot of complicated lighting effects and painting, because all the effects I needed were already in the line art. Whereas in the foreground stuff, with that, I want to play with coloring a little bit more. So now that we're getting to the main character, now we're going to a much purer red, at least starting with that. Everything still seems fairly muddy. That's giving me the freedom to put in a purer red for the mid-tone colors and then going into the highlights. But then also, when I eventually get to that part, I'll be putting in a secondary light source that's a lot cooler, kind of bouncing off the water, bouncing around the environment. And this idea of using a warm light source and a cool light source on the same object helps give it a sense of mass, a sense of reality. This isn't by any means photorealistic. That's not what I'm going for. It's not full on cartoony or anything, but I want it to have its own consistent reality. Everything in this environment needs to look like it all belongs in the same illustration. Um, Now, for inking, it's cleaner than the inking in the background, but it's still not as clean as I've done on some other pieces, certainly on some of the shinier robots, because I want it to be a little bit more distressed looking. I want it to be a little bit more rusty, a little bit more beat up. I've done a couple robot pieces like that in the past. I tend to do them a little bit more clean than this, but I like the idea of it for this robot demon character. Um, and then as I work on the mid-tone colors, I'll do the mid-tone painting over the entire figure. Then when I get to the highlights, I'll do the highlights over the entire figure. Now that I'm working on the secondary colors, I'm working on the secondary lighting, this blue, I'll do that over the entire figure. I won't just concentrate on just finishing the face and then moving on to the arm and moving on to the leg. I much prefer painting essentially the entire figure at once, so that parts of it don't feel underserved. That it all feels like uh, essentially it just comes down to I want the whole of the character to look like it's able to move. That I wasn't just drawing this to draw the face. I wanted the entire figure to have a sense of reality. And one thing that helps me with doing for getting that idea across is doing the entire figure in these stages. Again, doing all the darkest parts first, all the mid tones in the second, and just building it up to the brightest tones. Although the absolute brightest I tend to leave until I've painted everything else. So you can see now I've got most of the main figure colored, working on these cables using a very similar color and lighting approach on the cables and wiring and everything that's on her. Fundamentally, it's probably made of all the same material. Um, but then once I get that in place, I'll want to put in my brighter highlights. Now I've actually left gaps in the original line art for some of these highlights, but I can also paint some of these highlights over top of the line art. But I want to make sure I left in gaps, so I knew I wanted whiter highlights. I wanted much brighter highlights in these particular parts. Now, it isn't going to be as bright as some other robot designs I've done. Very deliberately, I want it to be a lot darker. But I still like having some brighter parts that go to white or almost white, just to get a sense that just get across the sense of it being metallic. Um, and then adding a little bit of that white, pulling that into the painting of the main body as well. So it's not just highlights on the outside, but it's also within the main character. And here, I'm starting to play with another special effects layer over top of the whole thing, basically to throw a little bit of a reddish glow over the entirety of the figure, starting with the foreground, getting across this sense of warmth, but not too warm. We still have a nice contrast going between her and the background. That nice in here, playing with the opacity on that, definitely pulled that back. And here we have the final finished piece. Thank you very much for hanging out and watching this, and I hope to see you in the next video.